Hello,
Good
hello.
evening, ladies and gentlemen. Howdy, Ron. How's it going tonight?
It's going well, Christopher. How's it going over on your side of the world?
We do seem to be having a little bit of lag tonight. So, ladies and gentlemen out there in the audience listening to us, we apologize. We're having a little bit of technical difficulty tonight, but we're gonna forge on through and hopefully won't lag or freeze up too much for you this. But with the going very well. Hope everybody had living. Said Ron, you were over at the family's house and having a little bit of a sort of a reunion gathering.
Exactly right. That's what it's anything to get me out of cooking because I'm not a very good cook, especially whenever it comes to like a big meal. So, yeah, I went elsewhere and it didn't even have to do with dish.
Not a bad deal. I had to
Yes,
cook
yes.
my first turkey
Yeah,
many years ago, and somebody told me that the easiest thing to do was just wrap the whole thing in foil, put a bunch of butter in there, and open it up 20 minutes before it was done, and salt and pepper it. And I tried it out; it worked like a charm, and I've ever since. So I can still
wow,
cook.
that's pretty impressive.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
I am
So I was
noticing some
terrified.
lag on. I am noticing some lag on both of ours. So we'll just tell the audience right now, in honor of tonight's show, we're both doing the show from sea. So we're already, we're 150 miles off the coast. So
Basically the computer wants to take a nap and is going to be a little on the slow side tonight. But
that's
no, we have a good show for you guys tonight. We did a little thinking because we were trying to come up with a good topic for this evening. And Ken, of course, our man in the chair, suggested the idea of doing something on ghost ships and nautical legends, which is a subject I'm a huge fan of. And we thought that would be a really fun option for tonight. And so we've got some great nautical seaside legends to go over this evening.
yeah,
Now,
I'm
Ron was
excited.
saying
Oh,
earlier that you have
God.
never seen the Pirates of the Caribbean movies, which blew my mind.
Yeah, I'm a big Johnny Depp fan, but I've never seen anything of the Pirates of the Caribbean more than just a few minutes of it. I know. I
Oh, wow.
apologize. I apologize. Yeah.
I feel like I
Yeah.
don't even know you, man.
But I will tell you, I don't think it's Shakespeare, so I think I'll be able to follow along.
Fair enough. Well, yeah. So I am a huge fan of these nautical stories. Of course, I've been a big fan for many years of the Pirates of the Caribbean films, and most of those movies sort of deal with the supernatural and curses and ghost ships and things like that. So they're very much a big thing of mine. But of course, that's all inspired by real legends. And I'm going to do something a little unorthodox tonight, Ron, if you'll indulge me on this one. And I'm going to actually start out with a story that I think is worth telling. And once we're done with the story, we can kind of break it down a little bit. But one of my favorite old New England legends concerns a pirate who sailed through the North Atlantic back in the 18th century, a man whose name Black Sam. Black Sam came to be called the Prince of Pirates, and he was very known for his uncommon sense of nobility and valor. He was not unusually cruel. He never killed if he didn't have to, and he was particularly well known for wearing his long black hair, which he was very proud of, loose without a wig. Wigs were very common at that time, but he would not wear a wig. He just tied his hair back with a silk ribbon, and so he was considered very dashing. In fact, interesting thing about the story of Black Sam Bellamy is many historians assume that he is the model for the sort of classic pirate image that we tend to think of today. His scarlet frock coat, which he favored wearing, his dashing style, said to the origin entirely of our modern idea of what pirates look like, how they dress, and even an inspiration for the look or design of Captain Hook. But Black Sam Bellamy started out as a very poor young man, and living in England in the very early 18th century, he decided that he was going to sign aboard a ship and go out in search of his fortune. And so it was probably around 1715, 1716 or so, he found himself on Cape Cod. He crossed the Atlantic on a merchant vessel, disembarked in Cape Cod, and landed in a little town called Wellfleet. And while he was living there in Wellfleet, he met a beautiful young woman who was only 16 years old at the time. Her name is said to be Mary or Maria Hallett, depending on which version of the legend you read. But she was a girl from a very good family. Unfortunately, although he tried to pay suit to her, his father, or Mary's father, would have no part of it because he didn't have a career, he didn't have a living. He was basically a penniless sailor and not worthy of his daughter, according to Mr. Hallett. And so the lovers were forced to meet in secret. Obviously, you can't stop true love. So Sam Bellamy and Maria continued to meet in secret until he realized that the only way he could ever marry her and make an honest woman of her was to make his way in the world. And so Sam Bellamy signed aboard a vessel, ended up going out into fortune on the open sea. And it wasn't very long before, as often happened with men in that age, he ended up turning to piracy, because piracy was a way that a man in those days, and for that matter, a woman from time to time, could actually forge a path of their own, forge a career of their own, and potentially rise above their station. And so he did, and he ended up being quite a successful pirate. In fact, Black Sam Bellamy ended up becoming one of the wealthiest pirates in history. Not that that would end up doing him an awful lot of good, but he did. And one of his greatest prizes that he took after a few years at sea was a ship that became a legend, and that ship was called the Galley. Now, it's his prize capture. It was a former slave ship, and when Bellamy and his crew set upon the Witta and captured her, he actually freed the slaves aboard and gave them the option to become a part of his crew, because he abhorred slavery, which is something that was actually fairly common with pirates, because pirates were very much about a free life, and any man was welcome aboard a pirate ship. It was kind of a scandal back then that this was, white men consorting with what some people considered to be savages, but the pirate credo suggested that slavery was completely unacceptable. So he had a crew made up of freed African slaves, Indians, white men, and any others who were willing to join. Now, when Sam found himself down in the Caribbean searching for treasure, he became richer and richer as every month went by. He, as they say, became one of the most successful pirates of his era. But meanwhile, back in Wellfleet, young Mary Hallett had a little bit of a problem. The first was that she was no longer able to hide the fact that she was carrying Black Sam Bellamy's child. Obviously, their marriage or their union had been unsanctioned. They were not married. And while Black Sam was out there making his fortune, her belly was growing day by day, and it was quite a scandal. She was outcast from her family. And so every day it said that she would go out to the bluffs and she would look out over the sea and wait for the sails for her lover to return. Sadly, that never seems to have happened. And as the about 2 or almost 3 years went by, Maria Hallett, eventually her love turned to rage, because she had her child, and the winter of that first year was so bitter and so harsh. She was forced to live in a small cabin with almost no support, and her young child died. This turned to rage, and it turned to grief, and they say that it was so strong and so powerful that standing on that cloud, she summoned a great storm, a tempest that blackened the skies over the Cape. What we didn't know is that that was the very day that Sam was returning from the sea. So those waves battered the Witta Galley and sent the ship and its entire crew, including Black Sam Bellamy, to their death. Since Hallett has always been known as the Witch of Wellfleet. She died alone, and she died shunned by the town, who believing that had these supernatural powers. But since that time, her ghost is said to wander the bluffs at Wellfleet to this day, still searching for her lost lover who never returned. As for Sam Bellamy, it's said that he is out there as well, that Sam Bellamy and the Witta still sail out there in the stormy seas off of Cape Cod, always looking to return to home port and never able to reunite with his lover. So this is a story I've been fascinated by ever since I was a kid. And one of the fascinating things about this story to me is that a marine archaeologist by the name of Barry Clifford back in the 1980s was under the impression that there was probably some element of truth to this story. And so he launched a project to try to locate the Witta Galley. And remarkably, in 1984, he did just that. So this is a really remarkable story, because it was the very first pirate ever discovered and excavated, which is something that had never happened before, and it remains quite a treat in archaeology. Now I have
Yeah, and from what I
a
gathered,
slide
there's a
here.
lot of
Seems
treasure that's coming
I
out from that, isn't
apologize. There is, yes, and actually slide of this in my haste to get some of these things to have missed it, but it is very true that there's actually a pirate museum in on the Cape Cod. I think it's in Falmouth, that has treasure from the Witta Galley. It has artifacts, it has guns, it has pieces of clothing, silver buckles, and things like that. And there is literally millions and millions of dollars of treasure that have been salvaged. Even the the role of the ship was salvaged and is there on display. And so again, it's a remarkable story because it is a story of very first pirate ship, and because they were able to recover all of the treasure from the ship, because Black Sam and his crew never had a chance to spend it, having capsized in that hurricane. They know that he was incredibly by the standards of those days. He had basically made himself a millionaire in in a short period of about 3 years, and was in fact on his way to return to Wellfleet when the ship was destroyed. And so, I mean, you know, when a legend comes true like this, I think it's remarkable, and the kind of thing that it just seems that rarely happens in life, when a legend turns out to be, as far as we know, quite completely true. I mean, whether Maria Hallett was a witch or not, we can't say that for sure, but most of their story appears to bear out.
Wow. Yeah, telling that story, I've always wanted to be a pirate as well too. But I don't know what name I would go by because I don't have this long flowing hair or anything. So it'd probably be like Ron the Bald Murphy or something like that. But man, there's something so evocative. There's something so evocative about the ocean. And there's a certain romanticism about just taking off into the high seas. And then whenever you pair it with these great ghost stories, what's not to like about it? I would love to see a movie made of this. I think it would be a great film.
It's been immortalized in some ways. In fact, there's a film that some of you might be familiar with called Practical Magic, which is actually a story about witches in a family of witches in Massachusetts. But the opening scenes of it talk about the heritage of the family and a young girl named Maria whose lover disappeared on her, left her with child, basically left her forlorn, and her love ends up turning into a curse. And when you read through the book and you watch the movie, all the names from the original story appear. And so while they don't ever specifically name Black Sam Bellamy, this story is basically about Maria and the curse that ends up following her family. So I think it's a fascinating story. But also there's a Netflix series that's called, I believe, The Lost Kingdom of Pirates. And it's a documentary, but it dramatizes the events. And they also tell the story of Black Sam and Maria among the many other pirates of the time. So in some degree, it's been made. But I think that honestly, a great film could be made of the story with the supernatural elements, the romance, and everything else. I think it'd make a phenomenal film.
Oh, right. Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. One more question though, before we move on. So the whenever he freed the slaves, do you know how many remained with him as part of his
It's
crew?
It's hard to say. Sam Bellamy actually had a fleet of ships. He had become powerful enough as a pirate that he basically, when they call him the Prince of Pirates, they weren't kidding. He had an entire sort of retinue of secondary captains that served underneath him. And when he was traveling north to return to Cape Cod, he actually had a fleet of ships with him, and all of them but one were wrecked. There was one that actually stayed behind, and it contained his uncle, a fellow named Palsgrave Williams, who lived on Block Island, a little bit south of Rhode Island. And he stopped off to see his family there and was supposed to join back up with Sam on Cape Cod. But because he stopped off on Block Island, didn't come immediately, his ship was the only one that was spared. But because there were multiple ships, there would have been multiple ships for the enslaved Africans to join up with. And if they didn't join up, they weren't executed or thrown overboard or anything. They were often given an outcast or like a discarded ship, because they would have smaller ships, they would have larger ships in their retinue, and so it said they were often basically the people that wouldn't join them were given a small vessel and allowed to go free. That was something that was not completely uncommon with pirates, but was particularly common with Black Sam, who again had this extraordinary reputation as a man of generosity and and sort of compassion, which is strange in what we think about with pirates. We tend to think of pirates in a very villainous way, but truthfully, most of these were just men in search of a life of their own. In an age when rising above your station, if you were born poor, it was unlikely you would ever be anything but poor.
No. Right. Now, do they ever report the ghost ship, the Wada, nowadays? I mean, have you heard anything recently about it?
I haven't heard any recent stories about it. It's a story that, like most ghost stories, it's told mostly through, personal anecdotes. And so I don't know if there's any official sightings, although in some of the stories we're going to talk about later, we do have some really remarkably eminent people who've cited some of these ghost ships out there. But the Witta, not so much. She's certainly said to patrol the waters out there. A lot of people do claim that they've seen the ghost of Maria Hallett out on the blood, but I don't know if there's any official or recent sightings of the Witta. I was actually in Cape Cod in 2018, because 2018 was the 300th anniversary of the destruction of the ship. It went down in 1718. And I was up there kind of hoping that, being the 300th anniversary, I'd get a sighting of the ship, but not so much. I did get to go to the museum and see quite a few of the artifacts left from the ship. If anybody out there has any interest in this kind of thing, I'd highly recommend to go. It is a remarkable thing to see these artifacts, like something straight out of a movie, from this incredibly wealthy pirate ship. One of the reasons that the ship ended up so well preserved is because when it was struck by the wave that took it down, the ship had in ballast of a large number of cannons, and those were used for ballast on the ship just to keep it upright, because the gold and the treasure that they had, it was worth a lot of money, but it didn't have a great deal of weight to it. And this was primarily, a ship that was designed to have a lot of cargo. So the cannons in ballast, the entire ship flipped completely over, but the cannons, which had now been in the hull of the ship, smashed down through the successive decks and pressed what was above them now, because it was above when the ship was upright, but now below them were the people, the equipment, the treasure, and everything, basically held down to the seafloor by the wood and by the weight of these cannons. And so nobody had ever been able to recover any of it, and most people didn't know where it was. It wasn't until the 1980s when Barry Clifford had brought his team out there, and they'd been looking for the wreck of the Witta for years. And this is a kind of a remarkable part of the story. They had interns that were working with them, and one day, after they'd been searching for years, they'd had clues, but they never actually found any definitive proof of the Witta. And they were out there, and one of their interns came up and said, "I think I see something down there that's a cannon." And the rest of the folks on the boat said, yeah, cannon, whatever, just get on the boat. We're done for the day. They were exhausted. It had been a long day. And he said, "Listen, just one person, just come down with me, dive down with me, just one more. We'll do it in 15 minutes. And because of who he was, because this intern happened to be somebody of a notable family, they decided to do it. So they sent a diver down with him, and they came up with news that this young man had found a cannon. And all of a sudden, they realized they were onto something. It was indeed a cannon from the Witta they'd found, and it was the moment of discovery that led them to find the ship. And the young man who found the cannon was John F. Kennedy Jr., JFK's son.
Wow. I had no idea. No idea.
Yeah.
Now, interestingly enough, where did his plane go down?
His plane went down. It was off of Cape Cod, wasn't it?
Yes, that's what I thought. Uh-oh.
Yeah.
The ghost of
the curse may in fact have struck after all. Who's to say? Gosh, hadn't even thought about that. That's an interesting observation there. So, but the story of the Witta again. Continue.
Yeah, this was in water that wasn't too deep then, right? We're talking about 40 feet of water.
I don't know the actual depth of the water that was there. I mean, it wasn't tremendously far offshore, but I mean, it was enough that it required a scuba team, and certainly it was a reasonable depth, but it was shallow enough that they could get to it without heavy duty equipment. But it was deep enough that casual divers would not run across it by accident. And as I say, in a kind of a remarkable turn of events, just because of the way the ship was destroyed, unlike most other shipwrecks, it had not been picked over. Nothing had been touched. Everything had been held underneath the silt and the sand for 300 years. Yeah, it's remarkable.
Wow. Christopher, you're a wealth of information. I think that you need a super chat tonight.
Yeah. wouldn't be bad. Of course, folks, I'm sure you all know that, as we mentioned last week, we are now open for tips. If anybody's interested in offering tips, and this kind of things always help us in what we do and keep us going here. Any sort of donations always help. We are going to be monetized. We'll be having some advertising. We apologize about that, but that's kind of part of the game here on Monday Night Monsters and the other shows here on Dead Air Full Spectrum. But yeah, so if anybody wants to help support what we do, we are always open to that. Obviously, never a requirement, but always very, very welcome. From the WIDA, I want
we're kind of like PBS with ghosts.
Talk about and this. I think we are. Oh, the PBS has their share of ghosts too, which I'm very happy about. There is another story, one that I think that almost everybody knows the name of, and we're going to be talking about now a ghost ship of a little bit of a different sort. This is a ghost ship in a little bit more of a mundane sense, but still one of, I think, the greatest mysteries of the 19th century. And I imagine all of you are familiar with at least the name, if not the story, of the ghost ship, the Mary Celeste. Now, is this one you're familiar with, Ron? Ron, it looks like you're muted.
I am. I'm just listening to you. Yeah, just listening.
No worries.
No. Yeah, one of my favorite ships as well too. This is going to be great.
It is. It's a remarkable story.
Yeah.
Fair enough. So, this of 1872, the crew of a ship called the Dei Gracia was actually crossing the Atlantic, and just off of the Azores, the little islands, Portuguese islands off the coast of Africa, they spotted a brig that appeared to be adrift, and that brig turned out to be called the Mary Celeste. She was a brig out of Boston, and when they signaled her, they got no response from the signaling and eventually decided to board the ship and see what was happening with her. They climbed aboard and they found that the ship was structurally still completely intact, no obvious damage. All of the lifeboats were present. There was a significant cargo aboard, primarily whiskey, a fairly valuable cargo. What there was not aboard the ship was a living soul, not a single human being on board that ship. Now, the crew of the Dei Gracia knew that they could actually get some salvage for the ship, so they ended up bringing it into port in Spain, if I'm not mistaken. And I apologize; this is a story that I hadn't researched in some years, and so I may have a couple of the details fuzzy on there. But I believe they went into Spain and ended up basically applying for salvage rights to the ship, and ended up being accused of having captured the ship and performing an act of piracy, something that they had to fight to be able to get the rights to the ship. They eventually cleared their own names of that, and there never did end up turning out to be any evidence that they were the ones who attacked the ship. But the thing about the Mary Celeste itself is that crew never, not a single scrap of evidence, not a single trace of them was ever found. The ship and its valuable cargo of whiskey completely intact, but no trace of Captain Benjamin Briggs, his wife, or any of the crew was ever found. And to this day, no one knows what became of them. And so it has remained well-known nautical mysteries of the last two.
Yeah, I remember first hearing about this.
One of the things about the Mary Celeste.
Sorry, we're just having some lag problems here, my friend.
Yeah,
but it's all good. But I was just saying, the first time I ever heard about the Mary Celeste was on an In Search Of program, and whenever I first watched this back in the 70s, they said that whenever people came to the ship, the coffee was still out. And it was still hot. You could still see the steam rising from it. So it disappeared.
That's a bit of the story that has been elaborated over the years. It is true that people have been saying that. They say there were still fires burning in the coal stove, that the food was set on the table and things like that. And that much of it is, as far as anyone has ever been able to establish, that much of it has been elaborated. It's just to sort of make the story spooky or make the story a little bit more eerie. there doesn't appear to have been any of that. But I will tell you that everything on the boat, including the personal belongings of the crew, were all still where they belonged. And one particularly chilling thing is that because the ship had probably been adrift for a little while, everything on the vessel was fairly damp. And they said that on the beds, you could still see the impressions of people who had been sleeping there as though they just vanished and hadn't even climbed out of bed, which is quite eerie considering the circumstances. In fact, the only damage to the ship was to its navigation equipment. The glass covering the compass and the binnacle, which housed their navigation, had been completely smashed, but nothing else damaged around it. So again, a very, very curious case. Now, interestingly, the Mary Celeste had a little bit of a reputation even before that time. When it was built in 1861, it was actually built in Nova Scotia. Launched as the Amazon, and the Amazon did not have a particularly savory reputation to begin with. On its very first voyage, the captain of the Amazon, which was not Benjamin Briggs, set off for England. They had a cargo of, I think, primarily hardwoods. Before they had been out for a week, the ship returned to port, long before it could have gotten to and from England, returned to port with the captain dead. The captain had actually, I believe the captain's name was McKenna, and the captain had died of pneumonia just a week of the voyage, with no indication that he'd been sick before they went. So people began to fear that the ship might be what they often referred to as a Jonah, which was a ship that had a curse associated with it. But it was a business ship, and the owners of the ship needed to press on, so they took their cargo, sent it right back to England. The ship arrived in England safely on its second attempt at the voyage, but on its way back out of port, it struck another smaller cargo vessel, destroying that vessel and sending it to the bottom of the sea along with all of its crew. So at this point, people began to fear that the Amazon was in fact cursed. It was several years later sold through a variety of owners that it ended up being renamed the Mary Celeste and passed into history as another, as a ghost ship and another ship that somehow either swallowed up or destroyed its own crew. And to this day, again, there's been never any sensible explanation. By the end of 1872, it would be at the heart of one of the world's most well-known nautical mysteries. However, one interesting ending to the story of the Mary Celeste is that it had been purchased yet again and eventually was scuttled intentionally, which is sunk off of the coast of, I believe, South America in 1885. Somebody intentionally sunk the vessel. And most people say that the reason for that was just put that cursed ship out of its misery and to end its curse. So, as far as I know, no one has ever excavated the wreckage of the former Mary Celeste, but people have certainly been talking about different theories about how that ship was destroyed, not how the ship was destroyed, but where the crew disappeared to, where the curse came from. And one of the most fascinating theories, and somebody just popped on a moment ago and suggested this idea, one of the most fascinating theories that has gotten a lot of traction, a lot of people really support this idea, is that the crew of the Mary Celeste had actually been abducted by aliens. And that one, I think, is certainly one of the more fascinating, if rather out there, suggestions, but it's one that people have a great deal of fascination with. And so who knows, maybe someday we will find that Benjamin Briggs and his family have been in suspended animation for all this time somewhere in a foreign galaxy. But until that time, I guess we'll just have to see.
Yeah. I don't know if there's any other logical explanation for what happened besides aliens, Chris.
Well, I'm not sure what use they would have had for those people, but of course, people have suggested that the aliens are abducting people for an awfully long time now. So, not an area that I have great expertise on. Although I know our man in the chair back there, Ken, certainly knows a lot about this subject. So, one of these days we'll actually have to do an episode on alien abductions and maybe discuss some of the theories on why aliens would have been taking people off of sailing ships, off of airplanes, or anywhere else that they may have. But for tonight, I think we're gonna stray from that particular topic and stick with the more supernatural aspects of ghosts. So there is a story set here in my home state of Rhode Island that I have always been fascinated by, and it's a story is known by a few different names. Many people locally refer to it as the Palatine Light. Now, the Palatine region is actually a region of Germany. And in Germany, in the Rhine Palatinate, back in the 1700s, there was a great deal of political turmoil. And that is one of the times when a tremendous number of effectively refugees, but certainly immigrants, left Germany and actually ended up coming here to the New World to settle and find a better life. Things were just in real bad shape in Germany. So in the 1830s, a ship left from Rotterdam in Holland with primarily German settlers aboard from the Rhine Palatinate. And that ship was called the Princess Augusta. It was a Dutch-built ship, and it left Rotterdam, I believe it was around 1832. Now, the ship never made it to the New World. It was actually on its way to, excuse me, it was on its way to Philadelphia, but never made it that far. It actually stopped off just across the channel in England for a few days. It did some restocking, resupplies, took on casks of water for the transatlantic voyage. And it was leaving comparatively late in the season. There are seasons that are better for transatlantic crossings because of weather patterns. There are seasons that are worse. They left fairly late in the season, certainly, late enough that they would expect to encounter some pretty harsh weather, but they had to make the passage. And so they left when they could, and they headed to the New World. As I say, they never made it there. When they were approaching the coast of the United States, they were terribly lost, delayed by storms, delayed by bad conditions. They said that aboard the ship, that food had begun to run out, that the water had spoiled or possibly been stored in casks that had mold in them. And so people were actually being made sick by the water supply on board. And probably worst of all, the captain of the ship, a fellow by the name of George Long, had died mid-voyage, leaving the first mate to take over the vessel for him. And that first mate is said to have been a monster, a pirate in his own right, one who extorted money from the passengers for clean water, for unspoiled food, and made the voyage a living hell. They ended up, as I say, very, very delayed. But when they finally approached the coast of the United States, they were well off course. And at that point, any port would do. They'd been at sea for so long, they just needed to dock anywhere to restock, get medical attention, what have you. So it was actually on Christmas Eve of that year, in fog peppered with snow, that they spotted a light in the distance and realized that they might well be saved. And so they headed for that light and ended up crashing into the rocks on the northern tip of an isolated little island a little bit off the coast of Rhode Island called Block Island. We were just talking about Block Island a few minutes ago when we were talking about the story of the Whydah, but they crashed on the northern tip of Block Island. They didn't know where they were at the time, but they do know that as soon as they crashed, they saw lights coming down from the hillside, and they hoped that it was people that were coming to help them. And it turns out many of the people of Block Island in those days survived as wreckers. Wreckers were people who profited from the salvage of damaged or beached ships. Now, this was a legal profession. You could profit from the salvage of these ships. However, it was only if the ships wrecked under their own power. Unfortunately, there were people that they often referred to as moon cussers. Moon cussers because a moonlit night was bad for them because people could see where they were going. But a moonless night was perfect because a ship could easily be lured off of its course. It said that these moon cussers lit a false signal fire, lured the ship onto the rocks, then swarmed the ship, stripped everything left of value on the vessel, and left the people there to die. At some point during the night, either a fire was lit, possibly they lit the wreckage to cover the evidence of their crime, possibly the fire broke out on the ship, nobody knows entirely, but the last anyone ever saw of the Princess Augusta was the burning wreckage disappearing beneath the water off of the northern tip of Block Island. And that, realistically speaking, should have been the Princess Augusta, but not to be, because a year later, once again on Christmas Eve, on the anniversary of its destruction, people spotted a brig off the northern tip of the island under full sail, and she looked like she was out of control. They say they looked like she was coming straight for the northern tip. She was going to crash, but before she reached the shore, she burst into flame and vanished beneath the waves. The wind started to howl, and all of a sudden the island was struck by a horrendous storm, the kind of storm that ripped the roofs off of houses and drove ships in their harbor to the bottom of the sea. And people began to whisper that the Princess Augusta had come back for vengeance. She continued to return every few years, they say, until the very last of the wrecker's own grave. But even after that, she would continue to return sporadically, usually as a woman of a terrible disaster at sea, some great tragedy, a killing woman of the sea. Now, this is a story, as I say, that I've grown up loving. People have claimed to see the specter of Block Island, or what they often refer to as the Palatine Light. Of course, because the people on board were Palatines, they referred to it because you always see it like St. Elmo's fire. This greenish blue fire off the coast of the island usually comes up in great spiraling columns like the three masts of a ship, and always as an omen of some terrible death at sea. And this has been seen by doctors and physicians, politicians. A fellow named Aaron Wiley, who was a very, very well-known and respected physician, wrote a letter to one of his friends because he used to summer on the island and talked about having seen the ship. So there are a lot of recorded sightings of the Palatine Light or the Princess Augusta. In fact, there are so many sightings that it often leads people to wonder, is it in fact a ghost ship, or is it some natural phenomena that people are reporting that simply mimics the appearance of a ghost ship that's been fooling people all these many years? It's gotten to the point where the question is not, is there a Palatine Light, but rather, what is it? Is it supernatural, or is it in fact some kind of a natural phenomenon?
Yeah, I want to have to go with aliens again. Mary Beth said aliens, portals, and Bigfoot. So we'll go with that until anything else comes in.
Well, I said Bigfoot may, in fact, have been coming ashore on the Princess Augusta. I guess there was one survivor. Well, there were several survivors of the ship who ended up eventually making their way to Pennsylvania, where they had originally intended to go. But a few people stayed behind and lived on the island, and one of them was referred to as Long Kate. They called her Long Kate because she was said to be extremely tall. She was known to be a fairly homely woman, and in fact could have been Bigfoot in a dress for all we know. But Long Kate also had to have a reputation as a psychic. Basically, she lived by giving or selling her visions and her fortune telling to the people of the island. And she ended up marrying a Native American man who lived on the island. And so, of course, that right there put her a little on the outs with what would call respectable people. So she had an interesting and presumably long life on the island, and her grave exists there to this day. So who's to say? Bigfoot, aliens, or Long Kate? Yeah. Somebody's responsible.
So have you ever witnessed the Palatine Light?
When I was a kid, I think I did, and I say I think because I was a very small kid, and my recollection is hazy. In fact, at the time, I didn't even know that there was such a ship as the Princess Augusta. But I used to live quite close to the beaches down in Middletown, Rhode Island, and there was an area where when you crested a hill for about 4 or 5 seconds, you could actually see the horizon line of the water, and then you dipped below the hill, and you didn't come out again to the beach another minute or two later. And as I came over the hill, I actually saw the silhouette of a ship that appeared to be glowing almost a bluish white color. And I said to my mom, "Hey, there's a big sailing ship out there." And she looked up and said, "I don't see anything," but we were basically dipping below the hill at that point. And I assumed that when we came back around the curve of the road and came to the beach that we'd be able to see it again. But by the time we got there was nothing out there. And that's always stuck in my mind because, I had no reason to believe that I'd seen a ship out there. Again, I was quite young at the time, and I had no particular fascination with sailing ships. I just thought I'd seen what I'd seen, and never turned up again. So that was the one and only sighting I have of what may have been the Palatine Light. And the positioning would have been just about perfect because I was looking down towards what's today known as Satchewis Beach, and from where I was on the road, I would have been looking directly south, which was right out towards by Block Island, which is not really visible from that area. But they say that the ship actually haunts all the waters around it. In fact, John Greenleaf Whittier was a 19th century poet, and he happened to be particularly fascinated by ghost ships and ghost stories, and called the Palatine Light. And I've always thought are very, very spooky. But still,
that's pretty
many a moonless night, from Kingston Head to Montauk Light, the specter kindles and burns in sight. First low and dim, then clear and higher, leaps up a terrible ghost of fire, till slowly sinking the flames expire. But the wisest skippers, though skies be fine, reef their sails if they see the sign. of the flaming wreck of the Palatine.
Oh, nice, nice. That sets the mood very, very nicely. Now, let me again ask you another couple questions here. What's on the other side of that horizon? Is there another island? Is there a town that wraps around there? Are you talking about a bay or what's there?
No, Block Island is about 12 miles south of us, but unless you are up quite high or the tide is incredibly low, you rarely can see anything except the barest ghost of the bluffs there. And even that's quite rare, because with even the tiniest bit of haze in the air, you won't be able to see it at all. And beyond that, there really isn't anything, because from directly south of Block Island, the land kind of curves away under Connecticut and curves away to the west. And so directly south of that, you don't really have any land mass until you get to Bermuda.
Very interesting. See, a lot of the times, whenever you talk about ghost lights and haunted ships, it almost appears to be a mirage. So we talk about like the refractory of light and things, almost as if you're in the desert. Because sometimes, whenever you're in the desert, you can see things that are quite far away, or certain types of plateaus that are distorted. But the sea's a little bit different. So the only way that this would work is if there was something over that horizon that was allowing the light to refract in such a way that you could see it in a different way than it actually is. So that's the reason I was asking you. So, and also all of my nautical information is based upon Billy Joel's Downeaster Alexa. So that's about my working knowledge of the sea. And he mentions Block Island Sound. Is this the same Block Island that you're talking about?
It is the very same Block Island Sound.
Wow.
It's named after a Dutch explorer by the name of Adrian Block, who was here in the 1500s.
Wow, very interesting. Yeah, see, Billy Joel pays off.
He does. You know what? There's some real good songs out there about ghost ships and about shipwrecks and things like that. Of course, everybody knows the Edmund Fitzgerald and everything like that. They really are good folk songs. So
they are. They do. Yes.
Well, you were talking about, the possible sort of rational explanations for these kind of thing, and it's a good segue. So I'm going to jump forward a little bit, and then we'll snap back, because there is one more really fun legend that I want to talk to. That's probably the oldest of all of these ghost ship legends. But first, let's talk a bit about what, in fact, could be happening if we wanted to look at this in a more scientific light. So why and how ghost ships may exist? Are they ghosts? Are they time slips, phosphorescent sea gas, aliens? What are ghost ships, and why do so many people seem to see them? And if you were looking for a scientific perspective, in fact, a rational explanation, let's stray away from supernatural or paranormal explanations for a moment and just talk about physical science. There are a couple of phenomenons that may, in fact, explain many of the ghost ship sightings that have happened over the centuries. One is often referred to by an title, Fata Morgana. This, believe it or not, means the fate of Morgan, and it's inspired by Arthurian legend and by Morgan Le Fay using magic glamours to lure victims to their doom. But Fata Morgana is a kind of a refraction of light that often happens over the water, because water tends to have different reflection levels, different sort of tidal pulls, and it changes the way the surface of the water looks and changes the way that it reflects. Now, these two images that you're seeing here have not been digitally manipulated in any way. And in both cases, it looks, especially with a quick glance, as if these ships are floating above the water. The only reason that you might imagine that they're not actually floating above the water is because in both cases, both of these sailing ships, the smaller one and the larger one, there's nothing beneath them. You don't see any kind of a low crest on the hull. You don't see a keel or anything like that. And that's because the keel is, of course, in the water. And if you look very carefully, depending on the resolution of your screen, you may be able to see, especially on the smaller sailing, the one that's on the left, there is a little bit of a reflection surface beneath that ship. That distortion of the water, however, especially at a distance through a spyglass, or in poor weather, could easily be mistaken for a ship floating up into the air, because our perception is entirely contextual. You might say, well, wouldn't people be able to tell that it was so low that it was not floating? No, because context, we see what appears to be a horizon, and our brain automatically adjusts to assume that that is the proper horizon. And so anything sitting above that line that tells our brain that we're looking at the horizon appears to be up in the air. And so in both of these cases, you're looking at a ship that is sitting in the water but has the appearance of floating, just based on a completely natural optical illusion. Now, you're talking about refractions of light, also often caused by temperature, and that is something that happens well. Thermal mirages. Now, these thermal mirages can project the image of something from a distance away. In some cases, actually project an image that appears to be on the other side of the horizon, actually past the curve of the Earth, but can cause a reflection almost like a projector and show an image of a ship that is at a much greater distance and show it either floating in the air or show it nearby, closer to where you're located. It can appear to make a ship look as if it's floating in the air, floating upside down. And if you attempted to turn towards it or watched it for very long, chances are it would simply shimmer and fade away as the conditions, which are rare, pass by. And so this easily, once again, very much like the kind of mirage you may see if you're driving down the road on a summer day and it looks like a puddle of shimmering water in front of you, and that puddle disappears the closer you get to it. That's very much how thermal mirages work, and could easily have made sailors believe that they were seeing a distant ship, that was out of normal sight, much closer to them, and then simply shimmering and fading into the distance, and believe that they had seen a ghostly vessel. Last but not least, something that, again, some of you may have experienced if you've ever been hiking or mountain climbing, or for that matter, if you've ever looked out the window when you were flying in an airplane and the sun was on the far side of the plane, you may have seen what's often referred to as the Brocken specter. Now, this happens when you have basically this glowing corona forms around your shadow. It's just an effect of an optical illusion. It's an effect of having the sun behind you, projecting your shadow into haze and kind of creating this image or shadow. And I've been on a plane and seen what looked like a shadow plane flying beneath us, but you would always see this corona around it, again, suggesting that this is more than the Brocken specter effect and a completely natural function of the light. In fact, even if you've ever stood and held a spray hose in the summer and gotten that corona effect that happens with the rainbow, you're seeing something that is a little bit of a similar idea. The water particles in the haze pick up that light, refract it back to you, and you have this ghostly figure, which can appear to be a person, it can be a vehicle, and it absolutely be the image of a ship as well. So all of these very, very reasonable natural explanations for why a person might see the ghostly image of a ship projected above the water, floating above the water, or easily vanishing as though it had.
Okay, you're back, right? Yes, nicely summed up, my friend. Nicely summed up.
Sorry about that. I know I can rattle on a bit tonight. Thank you, by the way, for indulging me again tonight, folks. This is a subject that's been a real big pet, a topic of mine for a long time, and so Ron has been very gracious in allowing me to prattle on like a fool tonight. So.
Oh no, this is fantastic. I'm learning a lot from this, and I'm glad that I'm part of this. This is great. But any of you listeners out there, please, let's get a super chat in here for Christopher so we can get him a modem.
Yeah, this freezing up is definitely something that we've got to get a handle on. Sorry about that, guys. So there's one more incredible story, one more absolutely wonderful story that I want to share, and it may be the oldest, or at the very least, certainly the single most famous ghost ship story throughout history, and that would be the incomparable legend of the Flying Dutchman. Flying Dutchman is the most famed and most feared of all phantom ships, a bringer of death and misfortune, captained by a damned soul and cursed to sail for eternity in an endless storm, never reaching home port. Now, most people these days who are familiar with the story of the Flying are familiar with it from the Pirates of the Caribbean films. The ship, the Flying Dutchman, is featured in three of the five Pirates of the Caribbean films. And in the first couple of movies, this is the story of a captain by the name of Davy Jones. But this is actually not part of the real Flying Dutchman legend. The story of Davy Jones actually exists completely separately. It's a myth of a sort of a sea devil. And the sea, you've often heard people say, sending somebody down to Davy Jones, meaning basically pushing a person overboard or watching a person drown. And when they get down there, they're captured by this devil of the sea, Davy Jones. But Davy Jones has no connection to the original Flying Dutchman myth. I believe that when the script writers were making the film, they just thought that he'd make a more interesting captain and maybe one with a little bit more storytelling sort of clout than the actual captain of the Flying Dutchman in the old legends, who's said to have been basically a crotchety old captain who cursed God because he was trying to make the Cape of Good Hope on the southern tip of Africa, just south of Cape Town. And that is an area of the world that is absolutely notorious for being beset by terrible storms almost all year round. There are very small windows of time when you can safely navigate around at the Cape of Good Hope, but it was a very important trade route. So a lot of people tried to make it. Sometimes their ships were destroyed. Sometimes they made it through, just driven back. So the story of this particular Dutch captain, who's often referred to as Vanderdecken, is that he decided that he was going to round the Cape, and he was going to do it in a time of year when it was very, very challenging to do so. But he figured his mettle, the skill of his crew, that they would be able to make it through the storms. They made the attempt and they were driven back. They made the attempt and they were driven back again and again and again. For months, they attempted this and constantly driven back. He wasn't willing to give up, and eventually he cursed at God. He shook his fist to the sky and he said, by the Almighty, I will continue to make this voyage, and I will make it around the Cape if I have to do it until Judgment Day. However, if you know anything about old legends, most of them tend to be morality tales. And for his hubris and for actually challenging the sort of the will of God, they say that an angel appeared on the deck of the ship, pointed at Captain Vanderdecken, and said that if he was willing to sail till the end of time, until Judgment Day, that he would get his wish, and that he would be damned along with his crew to sail for all eternity for that hubris. And so since that time, the story of the Flying Dutchman has been a very, very folk tale, not just down by the Cape of Good Hope, but all over the world. It's said that the ship ranges the world and ranges the water. And there's some fascinating stories that go along with it. They say that, for instance, if you ever come across the Flying Dutchman, that much like the story of the Princess Augusta, she's always an omen of some terrible disaster at sea or a bringer of death. But they also say that occasionally the ship will pull up alongside another vessel, and the men aboard, who will look emaciated and skeletal as if they are undead, will beg and plead and try to hand letters across to the people on the ship of mortals and hope that they will bring those letters back to their loved ones. Now, most people having basic compassion would want to do that, would say, of course I can return a letter to your loved one, but if you take one of those letters, you won't survive the night and you will wake up the next day one of the cursed crew of the Flying Dutchman. So again, a wonderful story, one that's got probably some some wonderful sort of mythic connection to it. But the Flying Dutchman remains probably the most popular ghost ship in all of history. And she has been seen by some very, very notable people. I think one of the most notable, maybe the most eminent person to have claimed to have seen the Flying Dutchman was a future king of England. It was in 1880 aboard the ship Bacchante that most English nobles served in the Navy for some period of time. It was considered to be good for character. And George V, the Prince of Wales, future king of England in 1880, serving aboard the Bacchante, recorded a very strange encounter in his journal. He wrote, "At 4 a.m., the Flying Dutchman crossed our bows, a strange red light as of a phantom ship all aglow, in the midst of which light the masts, the spars, and the sails of a brig stood out in strong relief. The officer of the watch from the bridge clearly saw her, as did the quarterdeck midshipman, but upon arriving, there was no vestige nor any sign whatever of any material ship to be seen, either near or right away to the horizon, the night being clear and the sea calm. 13 persons altogether saw her." So, I mean, that's a pretty notable person to make a report. And he was, this is a man who was a prominent noble. He wasn't about to make up a story like this and become a laughingstock. Kings or princes have a certain, degree of decorum they have to uphold. So if he's going to write that story in his journal and let it be known to the general public, he was pretty serious about it. Obviously believed that he had seen the Flying Dutchman. Worth worth noting, as I say, she's meant to be an omen of death. He goes on to say that that evening, one of the crew actually fell from the rigging to their death shortly after seeing the Dutchman, and so even that omen of death seems to have come true for them. So this being, as I say, one of the most well-known ships, one that's been there's an opera called Die Fliegende Holländer, which many people are familiar with, which is all about the flying. Shown in movies, shown up in plays, and I think probably one of the most fun versions of the Flying Dutchman has got to be the fact that he has become a main character in the SpongeBob series. So yes, despite the darker aspects of the legend, the Flying Dutchman is even a regular character in children's cartoons at this point, and so remains probably the most famous ghost ship and the most notorious and frightful one in all of history. So, what do you think, Ron? You think that that we're being haunted by ships? Or?
Well, I remember back in undergraduate, going through the Rime of the Ancient Mariner. These are very old tales, and they're told and retold, and there is something to them because they're so part of our vernacular nowadays, and so part of our universal thinking that there has to be something to them. Now, of course, ships do tend to be a very dangerous place to ply your trade. And I'm sure that people have been washed over and people have come across these strange ships out there. And it happens to this day as well, too, that people just come along a ship that has nobody aboard. But I think it's in the context in which it's found. It's in the water. It's something that's very alien to us to begin with. And not only that, but when we think of all these classic hauntings, one of the things that is said to really store these kind of energies, to manifest these apparitions, is water itself. And where better than out in the ocean to hold all these kind of energies and every now and then spring them to life like George the Fifth had seen. We still all there?
It's interesting to think. I mean, I've believed that. I'm here. Sorry. Again, thanks again for being patient with us. And we're trying to get these techniques worked out. But yes, I'm fully in agreement about that. I've often thought that it's interesting, the idea of inanimate objects having ghosts. I believe that ghosts are memories, and that a memory can be stored anywhere and in anything. And the idea that with enough people, especially on a ship, the ship becomes their home. It becomes their entire world. So the idea that their souls basically would sort of take on the form of that ship and almost create a communal haunting, and these ships would be able to rise from the seabed. There's a wonderful story. We only have a minute or two left. And I didn't want to, we have plenty of other ghost ships we could talk about throughout the course of the evening, but we have another one from my hometown of Newport, when back in the early 1700s, about 26 pirates, known as the Pirates of Gravelly Point, were hung for the crime of piracy. But when they hung the pirates, they rowed them to an area of unhallowed ground, and they buried them at the high tide mark, so that when the tide washed in, it would cover the graves in water. When the tide washed out, it would leave the graves exposed. That way they were buried in unhallowed ground, neither at land nor at sea, with the idea that it would curse these souls and they'd never be able to know their final rest. So there's a legend in my own hometown that at night, if you're down by the shores of Goat Island, that you can hear the pirates whispering from the water. But even better than that is the fact that the ship, the Ranger that they were captured off of, went down in our harbor and is supposed to be down there somewhere. But they say that on the nights that you can hear the pirates whispering, that the Ranger actually rises from the seabed with not a soul aboard and slips through the fog, listening for the cries of her lost crew. So you have a ship, not a soul aboard it, but ship, the ghost still exists, and you wonder, is that a manifestation of the pirate ghost, basically looking for something to take them away? Does the ship have its own ghost? It's a metaphysical question that I don't think anybody could answer.
Nice. I enjoyed this show. I enjoyed this show immensely. I didn't get seasick at all.
Well, I have to tell you that you really should. You owe it to yourself to at least watch the first Pirates of the Caribbean movie, because it is a straight up ghost story. It's a very classic ghost story, and I think that you'd probably enjoy it more than you expect to. And one of my very favorite lines is how we're going to close out the evening tonight, because the captain of the cursed ship in that one, Captain Barbosa, says a particular line that I've always loved. He's a young woman, and he says to her, "You'd best start believing in ghosts, Mrs. Turner. Ghost stories, Mrs. Turner. You're in." I think there's no more fitting close for an evening like this. So once again, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us this evening and for putting up with some of our technical difficulties. We'll see you again next Monday on Monday Night Monsters. And until then, have a spooky evening.